Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome to Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name, and my guest today is Peter Westmore, who's the National President of the National Civic Council. Thank you very much, Peter.
Very good to be here, Norm.
We'll do the format that we do, and this first session will be actually about who is Peter Westmore and how has he evolved spiritually before becoming active in the National Civic Council. So can I ask you, in the first instance, you're obviously Catholic. What was your process of becoming Catholic?
Yes, well, I was born a Catholic, so in a large family, and my dad was a doctor in Brunswick, a GP in Brunswick, a solo practice, and I was very fortunate, therefore, to grow up in a community which had both what I'd call sort of old Australians, and particularly from the 1950s onwards, sort of a lot of new Australians coming in. There were Italians and Greeks, and later on people from Turkey and other countries. So it was a very interesting environment in which to grow up, and one in which, as I went through school, I came in contact with a lot of people who had come from different cultures from my own. And I've often looked back on that and thought to myself just how fortunate I was to have met people who came from different backgrounds from myself, even different socio-economic backgrounds, and to see how much we had in common with each other. And one of the things I think which has, in a sense, much later in my life driven me has been this sense that all of us, doesn't matter which religion we're from or what our social background is or what country we came from, we're here in this country and we've all want to make it as good a country as we can. And I've always had this very strong sense that everybody who's in this country should be welcomed and should be seen as being asked and invited to contribute to making Australia a better place. And that's what our organisation's also about.
That's very interesting. I'd say that you could say that culturally you were introduced to a small C Catholic all the way through from that background.
Yes, yeah.
So where were you educated?
Well, my first school was at Parade Preparatory School, which was a Christian Brothers school. And then my parents took me away from there and sent me to Moreland High School. And after I was at Moreland High, I then went back to a Christian Brothers school. It was a scholarship school. And then after that, I went to St Kevin's College, which is one of actually my dad's old school before he went on to university himself. So I had the benefit of a very good education. And I think I was never conscious of having, in a sense, a sort of a social vocation, but when I look back, I was very fortunate to have had the upbringing that I did, and to have the sense that, we're not in this world just for our own enrichment or whatever. We're actually here to make as good a contribution as we can to ourselves, our families, and our society as well.
How did you find the interlude in the Moreland High School? That's sandwiched in between.
It was very interesting because having been to a Catholic school in my primary schooling, I had thought that Moreland High School would be basically a place where there was no place for religion at all. And I came to when I was there, I actually found that that Moreland High School, certainly at that stage, was a very good school, and it had there were quite a number of people who were Catholic on the teaching staff of the school at the time,
yes. Mm.
and that they were concerned with simply providing people with a very good education. Didn't have the religious component, but at Moreland High School there was respect for people who had religious convictions. So I thought this was actually, for me, a wonderful eye-opener, that I saw that even though they didn't have a commitment to a religion or a religious principle in terms of the running of the school, there was respect for people who had religious beliefs. And I didn't ever feel when I was there that I was unwelcome or whatever. In fact, probably 20% of the people at Moreland High School at that stage were Catholics, for all I knew.
Yes.
So,
and that then rolled over. So when you went to St Kevin's,
yes,
that was your higher education?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And what did you study there? What was
I studied up until year 10. I studied the full range of subjects. There were really very few choices at that point. But in years 11 and 12, I did maths and sciences predominantly. I did Latin actually up till year 11, and I did British history up until year 11. In fact, I won the British History Prize at school.
Well, congratulations.
Actually, in that year, in year 11, when I won that prize, my elder brother, who's a urologist in Melbourne, he was dux of the school. I was dux of year 11, and my younger brother Michael was the dux of year 10. So we acquired a reputation there at the school, which occasionally I run into some of my old classmates, which they still remind me of, and I am somewhat embarrassed by that.
Oh, well, it's a good thing to be embarrassed.
Well, except one doesn't like to stand out from the crowd as much as that.
No,
to be remembered now 50 years later for the family that you belong to. But it was a very good school, and I just got a very good grounding on in the subjects that I was doing. But in those days you had to choose near the end of secondary schooling whether you were going into the sciences or the humanities. And I think it was too narrow actually.
And we'll need to choose something at the moment because we need to go to a break.
Yep.
We'll go to a break and look forward to speaking to you soon. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and my guest today is Peter Westmore, who's the National President of the National Civic Council. And Peter, we've been tracing your history through your schooling, and you've reached St Kevin's, and you did pretty well with your dux of that history. Year 11, wasn't it? You were dux
yes,
off? Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. What happened then?
Well, I finished year 12 and I wanted to do aeronautical engineering, but there wasn't a faculty, a department rather, of aeronautical engineering at Melbourne University. So I went to Melbourne and spent 2 years just in the common engineering course, which was available then, and transferred to Sydney University in my third year. Now, I wasn't a brilliant student at university. I did reasonably well, but not a brilliant student. And it was really, in a sense, only when I went to Sydney, I think, when, for the first time in my life, when I was away from home and probably looking for new friends and all of that, that I really became involved in the what ultimately became my life's work, and that is I became involved in sort of student politics at the time.
Okay.
And that was, I think, probably mainly a consequence of being away from home, that
Yes.
I needed to find friends. And I was very concerned at the time as to what was happening at the university. It was a time of mass protests, what an American professor, John Searle, described as the campus wars. And I'd already done 2 years, so I had a handle on what university life was all about. I was very, very concerned with what was happening at the university, what was being published in student newspapers, which I very strongly disagreed with. And I looked around to the question and to say, am I the only one who thinks this way? And I found that there were a group of young students there who thought the same way as I did, and they happened to be connected with the National Civic Council.
Oh, okay.
They ran a university club called the Democratic Club, which I joined, and then I was invited to a meeting at the National Civic Council, which I went to, at which we collectively sort of discussed not just university matters, but more broadly what was happening in society. And again, I found that the people who were there, who were, if you like, followers of the famous Bob Santamaria,
Yes.
who was a national public figure in
Yes,
Australia
indeed.
at the time, I realised that these people were concerned not just about what was happening at the university campus, but what was happening in the broader society. And I found when I met them that actually I thought, these are matters which I'm concerned about as well. So I was drawn gradually into an association with the National Civic Council through my involvement at Sydney University.
What were just briefly, the key stumbling blocks that you struck at university, which made you say, well, these views are troubling me? What were they at that time?
Well, the thing that affronted me most of all was, this was the time when Australia was involved in the Vietnam War, and I was, of course, a university student, so my number was in the lottery which was to come up. And I had taken the view that if my number came out of in the draw, that I would simply go in and do my 2 years of national service, and then I'd resume my university life. But there were many people at the university who were utterly and completely opposed to conscription or national service, and who were utterly and completely opposed to Australia being involved in any way in the Vietnam War. And many of the same people were people who were controlling the student newspaper and pouring relentless pro-Viet Cong propaganda down the throats of students like myself. And I resented the fact that these people were as influential as they were when they didn't reflect my views, and I knew the views of a lot of other students. So I wanted to try to do something about that. Now, that's on the, if you like, the political front.
Yes.
But at the same time, there was also things happening to me internally, because I'd grown up as a Catholic, and, I went to Mass every Sunday, but that was the limit of my religious sort of involvement. But partly because of the people with whom I was mixing, who tended to be sort of strongly Christian, but also what was happening in society at the time. This was a time when there was a move away from organised religion entirely, and there was a very strong move in society towards, if you like, a counterculture. There was the period of sort of the sexual revolution, flower power. A lot of these things were all floating around, not just sort of bell-bottom trousers and all of that sort of stuff, but there was a cultural move going on in the broader society, which I was well aware of. There was also the growth of the drug culture, certainly at the university. And when I was on the Students' Representative Council, I mean, you'd walk into meetings sort of through a haze of marijuana smoke and all of that sort of stuff. So I was really well aware of all of that. But interestingly, probably because of the exposure that I'd had to it and my background, I actually reacted very negatively to all of that sort of stuff.
Yes.
So I responded to all of these new movements in society and so on by, in a sense, becoming more strongly attached to the value system which I'd been brought up with.
Yeah.
Now, I had to make a decision, and I was conscious of that, but I thought, this is the road to destruction. If it is not the road to personal destruction, it is the road to destruction of the university or of society. And I didn't want to have any part of that. So, again, probably influenced by the people with whom I was associated, I actually came to, my ideas were clarified by all of the things that were going on, and actually became stronger in my commitment to my to patriotism for our country, the importance of being patriotic, but also to my religious faith. And it was a time also of turmoil inside the Christian churches, including of the Catholic Church at that time. We had, I think the Pope at the time brought forward a statement which aroused enormous controversy on contraception, which you may be aware of, but which certainly was one, again, there were convulsions within the Christian community and certainly within the Catholic community, which up till that time people had thought was monolithic.
Yes.
And it really showed that that was not true, that the broader cultural trends were influencing the churches quite profoundly. And I think that's continued to the present day.
Yes, and that's a very great summation of what was happening in those times, to my recollection. We'll go to a break, thank you, Peter. We'll be back shortly with this fascinating topic. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and my guest today is Peter Westmore, who's the National President of the National Civic Council. And Peter, you've given us a very interesting summation, and you're in the university, your views have been consolidated by the political activities in the 60s and 70s, and now out you come, connected to the NCC, recommitted, if you needed to be, to your faith.
Yes.
What happened then?
Well, it was a logical progression. I finished a Master of Engineering Science, and I was asked by Bob Santamaria whether I would work for the organisation. Now you have to keep in mind, I had 2 degrees in engineering, and I didn't really want to do this work. But I thought about it, and I thought, there are plenty of people around who are going to be as good engineers as I am, but there are actually very few people who will do the work that he wanted me to do, which was to help to build the university groups which I'd been involved with right throughout New South Wales. And so I said, I'll give you 2 years. And here I am now, roughly 40 years later, still doing the same work that I said I'd spend 2 years on. So it was really, I went to work for the National Civic Council, and in 1976, Bob Santamaria asked me to move from Sydney, where I had been working in our office in Sydney, down to our national office in Melbourne, to work as a researcher for him. And I worked as a researcher for him for a number of years. Then I became National Secretary of the NCC, and when he passed away in 1999, I became National President of the NCC, and I've held that position since then.
So you could be truly described as an activist in that context.
Yes, that's right.
And what sort of changes have you seen, like in the 70s, the NCC in the 70s, and the NCC today, of which you're the national president?
Yes.
What sort of changes would you describe as having taken place?
Well, in the 1970s, the focus of our work was, firstly, a good deal of it was the work that the organisation originally had been involved with, which was a battle inside the trade union movement to support basically moderate or anti-communist sort of unionists. And that battle was taking place in many unions around Australia. I became involved because of what was happening at the universities, and that was an expansion of the works of the NCC that happened in the 1960s. But separately, there were a whole series of other things happening in society which were of concern to Bob Santamaria and his colleagues, and among them were the problems which arose from the rise of the radical feminist movement, which had quite a different agenda for how Australia and the role of women in society, which had an influence upon the National Civic Council in terms of the works that we were involved with. There was the growth of the problems of family breakdown in society, and certainly it was Bob Santamaria's very strong view that we needed to support the family as the fundamental social unit in society, not simply to leave families to manage as best they can, and then if there's a breakdown we try to help to pick up the pieces. Right. Try to hold families together. And on top of that, there were also major developments in the financial community within Australia. We had the very strong push towards financial deregulation in Australia. We had the sell-off of what had previously government-owned utilities in Victoria, for example, the electricity system, the power stations, the tramways, the railways had been privatised. And these were new issues of public policy which ultimately affected ordinary Australians. And they were new areas in which the National Civic Council felt it should take up a position. And then on top of that, we had, if you like, the further development of what had begun in the 60s with this cultural revolution, where religion was in decline in Australian society. And we also had the rise of two things. One of them was what an American theologian called, I think very pertinently, he called the atheism of distraction.
And I'm going to have to introduce the atheism of time. We're going to speak next session about the NCC in great detail, and thank you very much, Peter. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.